Snow began to fall in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana a full month earlier than anyone predicted, laying a treacherous coat of white over the jagged pines. Clara Higgins stood ankle-deep in freezing mud, staring at the concrete foundation of what was supposed to be her sanctuary. Her hands, calloused and blistered beneath heavy leather work gloves, ached with a dull, constant throb. She was 42, widowed, and completely out of her element. At least, that was the consensus among the seasoned off-gridders who occupied the neighboring acreage. David, her late husband, had purchased this 10-acre plot 3 years ago with a dream of building a self-sustaining homestead. When a sudden heart attack took him at 44, Clara didn't sell the land. Instead, she left her high-pressure architectural firm in Chicago, packed her life into a rusted Subaru Outback, and drove west. She was determined to finish the dream, but she wasn't going to build the rustic, drafty log cabin David had sketched on bar napkins. Clara was a structural engineer specializing in passive energy systems. She was going to build a fortress. Her neighbors, however, viewed her arrival as a tragic comedy waiting to happen. Isaac Boone, a third-generation Montanan who lived 3 miles down the ridge, was the first to offer his unsolicited skepticism. He chewed on a toothpick, leaning against the bed of his Ford F-250 as he watched Clara hire an excavator to dig deeply into the south-facing slope of the mountain. "You're making a mistake, Clara," Isaac warned, his voice a low gravel pit of condescension. "You don't dig a house into the dirt up here. The frost heave will crack your walls, and the ground will freeze you from the outside in. You need thick, round spruce logs. You need a wood stove big enough to fit a whole trunk. What you're building, it's a tomb." Clara wiped a streak of mud from her forehead. "It's an earth pyramid passive solar design, Isaac. The frost line is 4 feet down. I'm going 8 feet. The earth stays at a constant 50 degrees year-round. I'm using the mountain as a thermal battery." Isaac spat into the dirt, shook his head, and drove away. Word spread quickly among the small, tight-knit community of off-gridders. Harrison Miller and Brenda Cartwright, 2 other veterans of the Bitterroot winters, soon took to driving past Clara's plot just to shake their heads at her progress. The drama escalated when Clara's building materials arrived. Instead of bringing in local timber, flatbed trucks delivered massive sheets of extruded polystyrene insulation, specialized triple-pane argon-filled windows from Germany, and hundreds of pounds of fire brick and clay. The physical toll of the build was brutal. In late October, a freak storm dumped 6 inches of snow, halting construction. Clara was working alone, trying to maneuver a heavy steel culvert into place to act as an earth tube for fresh air ventilation when the chain slipped. The steel pipe slammed down, narrowly missing her leg but pinning her heavy winter coat. She was trapped in the freezing mud for 2 hours before she managed to cut herself free with a pocket knife. Shivering violently, borderline hypothermic, she sat in her heated car and wept. It was the first time she truly considered that Isaac might be right. The mountain didn't care about her engineering degree. The mountain only cared about survival. But the next morning, fueled by a stubborn grief and a refusal to let David's dream die in the mud, Clara went back to work. She constructed the core of the cabin using insulated concrete forms, ICFs, creating walls that were virtually impenetrable to the wind. She banked the earth up against the north, east, and west walls, burying the house into the hillside. The entire south-facing wall was comprised of angled, high-efficiency glass, perfectly pitched to catch the low winter sun. But the true heart of her design, the element that drew the loudest laughs from Harrison and Isaac, was what sat in the center of the living space. It wasn't a cast-iron wood stove. It was a massive 4-ton masonry structure made of cob, stone, and fire brick. It looked like a giant earthen bench attached to a barrel. "It's a rocket mass heater," Clara explained to Brenda one afternoon when the older woman stopped by to drop off some surplus tomatoes. Brenda looked at it with pity. "Honey, you can heat a house in Montana with twigs. Harrison has 15 cords of split oak ready for the winter. You have a pile of scrap wood and branches. A traditional wood stove sends 80% of its heat right up the chimney, Clara replied patiently, though exhaustion was wearing her thin. This burns sideways. The combustion chamber reaches 1800 degrees. It burns the smoke itself. Then the exhaust is forced through a labyrinth of pipes inside this earthen bench before it exits the house. By the time the exhaust leaves, it's barely warm. The stone bench absorbs all the heat and radiates it into the room for 3 days after the fire goes out. I don't need 15 cords, Brenda. I need 2. Brenda smiled a tight, sad smile. Well, I'll tell Harrison to keep his snowmobile ready. When you freeze out, you call us on the radio. November gave way to December, and the true test began. The first few weeks of winter were standard for the Bitterroot's temperatures hovering around 0. Biting winds. The locals were busy feeding their stoves every 4 hours, chopping wood in the snow, watching their propane gauges nervously. Clara, however, was experiencing a profound, quiet victory. On a morning when it was 10 degrees below 0 outside, she walked around her cabin in a t-shirt. The sun poured through the south-facing windows, hitting the dark stone floors and the massive cob bench. The earth burning on 3 sides meant the absolute coldest her walls would ever get was 50 degrees, leaving her to only make up a 20-degree difference to achieve comfort. She fired the rocket mass heater for 2 hours each evening, using handfuls of deadfall twigs. The bench became a massive radiant heating pad that kept the cabin at a perfect 68 degrees around the clock. Then came the second week of January, and with it, a meteorological anomaly the news stations were calling the Arctic Hammer. It started with a deceptive stillness. The sky turned a bruised metallic purple. The barometric pressure dropped so fast it made Kara's ears pop. Then the wind descended like a freight train. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. With the sustained 60-mile-per-hour winds, the wind chill was incalculable. It was the kind of cold that shattered metal and froze lungs in seconds. Inside her cabin, Clara watched the digital thermometer mounted outside her window flash 45 degrees Fair. Inside, her thermostat read 68 degrees Fair. The thick, airtight walls and triple-pane glass completely silenced the roaring wind outside. It felt peaceful, but Clara's stomach churned with anxiety. She turned on her CB radio, tuning into the local emergency channel. Data hissed aggressively, then a broken, panicked voice crackled through. Lines gelled. Generator is dead. It was Harrison. Clara grabbed the mic. Harrison. This is Clara. What's your status? Stove can't keep up. Wind is blowing right through the chinking. It's 12 degrees in the house, Clara. Isaac is here. His roof buckled under an ice dam. Brenda's propane regulator froze solid. We're all at my place. Burning furniture. Harrison's traditional log cabin, built with massive, beautiful spruce logs, was a victim of its own design. Wood naturally shrinks and expands. The fierce winds were pushing negative pressure into the cabin, literally sucking the heat out through microscopic cracks in the chinking. To make matters worse, traditional wood stoves require massive amounts of oxygen to burn. They were pulling the freezing outside air into the house just to keep the fire going. They were trapped in a thermodynamic nightmare. Harrison, wrap up in everything you have. I'm coming, Clara said. No. Harrison's voice was desperate. You die out there, city girl. You stay put. We'll try to make it till morning. The radio would dead. Clara didn't hesitate. She knew they wouldn't make it until morning. At 12 degrees indoors, without a working heat source, hypothermia would take them before dawn. She geared up. Thermal base layers, an expedition-grade down suit, ski goggles, and a neoprene face mask. She strapped on a pair of modern, lightweight snowshoes, grabbed a coil of alpine rope and 3 heavy emergency Mylar bivy sacks, and stepped out her door. The moment the wind hit her, she was knocked backward. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical assault. It felt like millions of tiny needles driving into the exposed sliver of skin near her goggles. Visibility was 0A complete, disorienting whiteout. Relying entirely on a handheld GPS unit and her memory of the terrain, Clara began the agonizing trek toward Harrison's property. It was only 2 miles through the woods, but fighting through 3-foot snowdrifts and hurricane-force winds made it feel like an ultra-marathon. She fell twice, her muscles screaming in protest, the ghost of David's memory pushing her to get back up. Build a fortress, she told herself. Now bring them to it. It took her 2 hours to reach Harrison's cabin. The structure looked pitiful against the storm, a dark, freezing box. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. Clara slammed her shoulder against the heavy wooden door, forcing it open against the wind. Inside, it was a scene of quiet devastation. The temperature inside was a brutal 13 degrees. Harrison, Isaac, and Brenda were huddled on the floor mattress, wrapped in a mountain of moving blankets and sleeping bags, shivering so violently their teeth were clicking. The magnificent cast-iron stove in the corner was dark and cold. Isaac looked up, his face pale, frostbite forming on his nose. "Clara," he whispered, his voice weak. "You shouldn't have come. We're done." "Get up," Clara ordered, her voice cutting through the howl of the storm outside. She didn't have time for their pride. "Your stove failed. Your house failed. We are leaving right now. We'll freeze on the way," Brenda sobbed. "You'll freeze if you stay," Clara yelled. She tossed the Mylar bivy sacks at them. "Put these over your coats. They'll reflect your body heat. Tie yourselves to this rope. I'm leading you back to my place." Harrison, normally a towering figure of mountain machismo, looked utterly defeated. He didn't argue. He slowly got up, his joints stiff, and helped Brenda to her feet. Clara tied the rope around her own waist, then secured the others, spacing them 5 feet apart. "Do not let go of the rope. Do not stop moving. If you fall, I drag you," Clara commanded. The journey back was a waking nightmare. Isaac stumbled repeatedly, his energy entirely depleted. Clara had to physically pull the rope, throwing her entire body weight forward to keep the line moving. The wind screamed through the pines, snapping heavy branches that fell dangerously close to them in the dark. Clara's lungs burned with every breath of the sub-zero air. She could feel her own core temperature beginning to drop. The specialized gear was failing against the absolute extreme of the Arctic hammer. Just as Clara's vision began to tunnel a dangerous sign of exhaustion and cold, the angular, snow-covered mound of her cabin appeared through the whiteout. She dragged the 3 locals to her front door, punched in the mechanical code with numb fingers, and practically shoved them inside. She slammed the heavy, insulated door shut, engaging the multi-point locks. Instantly, the roaring noise of the storm vanished, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. Harrison, Isaac, and Brenda collapsed onto the dark stone floor, panting, their mylar blankets rustling loudly. And then they stopped shivering. Isaac slowly pulled his snow-caked goggles off. He unzipped his frozen coat. He looked around the brightly lit, open concept room. There were flourishing green plants in the windowsills. Brenda pulled off her gloves and touched the floor. It's warm. The floor is warm." Clara, leaning against the door to catch her breath, stripped off her mask. She walked over to the massive earthen structure in the center of the room. She struck a match, opened the small glass door of the combustion chamber, and lit a small pile of twigs and a single piece of split pine. Instantly, a horizontal jet of flame shot sideways into the chamber, with a quiet, powerful roar, the sound of a jet engine, muffled under earth. Harrison stared at the digital thermometer, mounted on Clara's interior wall. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, sure that the hypothermia was making him hallucinate. 68, Harrison breathed. He looked at Clara, then back to the thermostat. He remembered the thermometer in his own cabin dropping to 13 degrees before they left. Clara's house was exactly 55 degrees warmer than his, and she was doing it with a handful of sticks. "Take your coats off," Clara said softly, walking into her small kitchen to put a kettle on the induction stove. Go sit on the bench. It'll warm you to your bones. Isaac, the man who had mocked her for building a tomb, slowly crawled over to the cob bench. He pressed his back against the warm, curved earth. The radiant heat immediately began to thaw his frozen muscles. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. You built it in the dirt, Isaac whispered, all replacing every ounce of his former condescension. The ground didn't freeze you. The ground protected me, Clara said, bringing over a tray of steaming mugs of tea. The storm can't steal heat from the earth, Isaac. It can only steal it from the air. For the next 3 days, the Arctic hammer raged across the Bitterroot Valley. Roads were impassable. Power lines snapped under the weight of the ice. Across the county, pipes burst, and emergency services were overwhelmed. But inside the partially buried cabin on the south-facing slope, 4 people sat in comfortable t-shirts. They drank tea, played cards on the warm floor, and listened to the muffled, distant howl of the storm that couldn't touch them. The rocket mass heater consumed only a small bucket of wood scraps each day, yet the cabin never dropped below 67 degrees. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, a brilliant, blinding sun reflected off the 6 feet of fresh snow. The temperature crept back up to a manageable 10 degrees. Harrison, Isaac, and Brenda stood on Clara's porch, putting their heavy coats back on to make the trek home. They looked exhausted, humbled, and profoundly grateful. Harrison turned to Clara. He didn't offer a macho handshake or a stoic nod. He pulled her into a tight, genuine hug. I owe you my life, Clara. We all do. I was wrong. I was so damn wrong about you and about this place. Brenda kissed Clara's cheek, tears in her eyes. Isaac lingered a moment longer. He looked at the massive glass windows. The snow cleanly melted away from the earth berm, and the tiny wisp of white steam escaping the exhaust vent. He looked at Clara, the city girl, who had just schooled them all in survival. Hey, Clara, Isaac asked, shuffling his boots in the snow, his pride entirely gone. Yes, Isaac. When spring comes around, do you think you could show me those blueprints? Clara smiled, the memory of her late husband warming her heart just as much as the house warmed her bones. I'd be happy to, Isaac. I'll even help you dig the dirt.